Hello and welcome to City Futures Estate Centre Seminar Series. I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the traditional land of the Fijigo people of Eora Nation and would like to pay my respect to elders past and present, as well as to any First Nation people joining us today. If you're joining online, please mute your microphone and turn off your camera during presentation. Once we got to Q&A, you're welcome to turn on your cameras and unmute yourself. You can also put a question into the chat and we'll be monitoring for questions. Now I would like to hand over to Dr. Chris Martin, who will introduce today's presenter.
Thanks, Marianne. Thanks everyone here and online for joining us today. One of the nice things about working at City Futures, and you'll have gathered this from attending City Futures seminars, is the range of disciplinary backgrounds and research interests that are represented in the centre. And sometimes that range gets represented in a single person, and our speaker today is one of those people. So I think you've heard Dr. Fatemeh Aminpour before at a seminar talking about another of her lines of work. She's comes from a landscape architecture background. She does research in schools especially and other spaces that need to be supportive or caring as part of their function. Today, she's talking about another aspect of her work, her housing policy research, and in particular a recent project she did commissioned by the Australian Housing Research Institute on access to housing assistance. So I'm very pleased to welcome her and to give her attention. Thank you.
For this nice introduction. So today I'm going to present this project and part of that project, effectiveness of private rental assistance in managing access to housing, which is part of this HURI project, getting off the waiting list, managing housing assistance provision in an era of intensifying social housing shortage. And this is part of a broader inquiry program into supporting pathways in a social housing system, which is being led by Chris Martin. This is a collaboration between UNSW and RMIT, and as Chris mentioned earlier, it has been funded by HURI, and the whole report has been published earlier. We can access that through this QR code. Okay, so why do we focus on private rental assistance? Because there has been a shift from social housing provision to more diverse forms of housing assistance. And this has been reflected on this table on the screen, as you can see. The number of private rental assistance transactions has been around 70,000 in 2021-2022 financial year. But on the other hand, we have the social housing tenancy allocations just below 30,000, which is like half and as many as those who received private rental assistance. You can see also on the screen that many people, by far, received specialist homelessness services, but our focus is not on this today, and neither is on Commonwealth rent assistance. So we're going to focus on private rental assistance that has been managed by state and territory governments. These are the list of research questions that we looked at in this project. So we wanted to explore the perspective of housing policymakers on how they actually manage the shift from social housing to other forms of housing assistance. We also explored applicants' experience the housing assistance application process, the scope and outcome of the housing assistance options, and also the experience of wait for social housing. And then we concluded our project by discussion of the accountability in access to housing assistance and how it can be improved systematically. Also, we asked the policymakers about what applicants can expect by right from the application and the outcome of their assistance. We used these methods that's been listed there. We reviewed the literature and policy, both national and international, and we conducted some agency in-depth interviews with housing policymakers in New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, and ACT. We did waiting list and housing assistance data analysis across all the jurisdictions in Australia. And the most important part of that was an applicant survey, which was sent out in 3 jurisdictions, New South Wales, Victoria, and ACT. We received around 1,600 responses, and then we followed up that with some in-depth interviews, around 40 in those states. So how are these private rental assistance programs managed and for whom? So we have social housing and private rental assistance that has been targeted at different cohorts. Social housing has been targeted at households with social, medical, financial, acute vulnerabilities. But on the other hand, we have private rental assistance that has been targeted at households whose needs are less acute, and they can actually sustain private rental tendency after they receive these types of support. There are some affordability cutouts, and it's mostly about the percentage of their income. It's about 50 to 50% of the income. So the rent that they are applying, the rent for the property that they are applying for must be less than this amount. And this is quite consistent across, Australian jurisdictions. So this distinction between who's actually receiving social housing or who's receiving private rental assistance kind of like made at the beginning when an applicant is applying for social housing. And but it's not the case always. The application and assessment process for social housing and private rental assistance are kind of like or often integrated, especially in New South Wales and in Tasmania, these 2 jurisdictions that are case studies, but it wasn't integrated in ACT and Victoria. So that assessment kind of occurred at, on an ad hoc basis. What's the rationale behind offering private rental assistance? So the main rationale is actually embedded in this slide, that it's making sure that those who can sustain private rental, the private rental tenancy are better off, out of this social housing system. But also to make sure that they relieve pressure on wait lists, so they can actually divert those lower need applicants to private rental assistance. This diversionary kind of approach has been applied in, as you can see, in Tasmania. So the table shows that around half of those who actually were deleted from the wait list, were deleted from the wait list because they actually accepted some other housing assistance products. But this wasn't the case specifically in ACT and in Victoria. So those who received private dental assistance could actually remain on the list. In New South Wales, it's kind of like Tasmania, because when they receive some rent support, they during the time that they were supported, usually like 3 years, they were suspended from the wages. So this approach is quite different from state to state. The other rationale is that they could be provided stopgap housing while they are waiting for social housing, because as this housing policymaker said, the wait times for social housing are just so great or so extreme, so they could be supported in the meanwhile. Was it considered a diversionary product by applicants? We asked actually 2 questions from them, and they level of agreement with these 2 statements. The first one, we asked if they've been discouraged by the state or territory government from registering for social housing. Like more than half of those disagreed with this statement. So they were not discouraged from registering for social housing. But just keep in mind that these 2 cohorts that we're talking about, the first one actually are those that are on the wait list. They are already registered on the wait list. And the second cohort, cohort B, are those who received a social housing tenancy very recently. So they eventually were on the wait list. So this data should be actually integrated in caution. The other statements that we asked the level of agreement with was, if they registered for social housing more in hope than expectation. And as you can see, those who are on the wait list, they actually registered more in hope than expectation. What can applicants expect by right? When we asked this question from housing policymakers, they said that the application will be assessed consistently, fair and consistent assessment of applications as part of their procedural considerations is something that the applicant can expect by right. This is what they said. And when we asked the applicants, those who were on the wait list, this question, about their satisfaction with the application process, only 25% of social housing applicants who recently joined the wait list were satisfied with the process, but it was actually 60% who received a social housing tenancy. And this is a strong quote from one of our survey respondents that the process appears to benefit those who are better informed about the service than those who are struggling and would actually benefit and be grateful for the service. So the level of information that's been offered to the applicants played a significant role in their success in the application. And it brings us to the next point. What other things applicants can expect by right is the provision of advice and support, as policymakers said. But as they acknowledge that advice and advocacy is available, but it's administered on a more ad hoc basis. So I'm just reading aloud this part of this code. There is really varying interactions with our system as a starting point, and that's baked into our operational settings. Depending on who you are, you're going to be directed to a different workforce, or you're going to be instructed to follow a different process. So it's not something that's consistently being provided. And when we ask applicants about how helpful they actually found the advice that they received, like 1/3 of them found this helpful, and 1/3 didn't find this helpful. And when we followed it up with our interviewees, Many interview participants who were recently offered social housing tenancy believe that without this help, they wouldn't have secured their tenancy. So they thought that this advice and information that they received at the beginning of this application process actually helped them a lot. Okay, this brings us to the other point regarding the application process, and that's about how the staff, the those agencies are communicating with applicants. As you can see, those that the numbers that have been highlighted shows those applicants who fail to reconfirm their interest, in just being on the wait list, and because of that, they've been deleted from the wait list, and they actually are like half of the total number of deletions from the wait list, which is a huge number. So we have this quote from a survey respondent who said, which said that they didn't text yes quickly enough to the text that they received from the agency, and that's why he were taken off the list multiple times, and he had to apply again and again. The final thing that our agency interviewees brought up, what applicants could expect by right was private rental brokerage services. So these services are being offered in some states, not all of them, and they help those applicants who received a private rental assistance to find a tenancy. So they mentored them during the process and helped them through the process to use this assistance and find a proper tenancy. But they acknowledge, the agencies, they acknowledge that they are probably not as effective at taking pressure off the wait list as it has been previously, and they said that it's really depending on the market conditions, and because of the current the market condition, and because of the current market, it's been really competitive. It's not necessarily very helpful, and it's consistent. This finding is consistent with a previous research. And I'm going to read aloud this quote because I found it really strong. For people who are on Social Security, the housing products that the department has, such as Rent Start, bond loans, and advance rate, are in practice inaccessible for nearly all available listings in the private housing market. When the department sets a maximum rent for which they'll provide bond, advance rent support, and that maximum is less than the rent that you're paying now and less than 99% of what's on the market, it's nothing more than a performative farce masquerading as social policy. And this was a quote from one of our survey respondents. Okay, so what applicants, those who were on the wait list or just received tenancy very recently, thought about the effectiveness of these programs from the survey. Only 30% of recent applicants were satisfied with the assistance they received. And it's actually notable that 38% didn't receive any kind of assistance or they had no opinion. But on the other hand, when we asked the question, from those who received tenancy very recently, 75% of recent tenants were satisfied with social housing that they received. So you can compare and contrast the satisfaction level across these two types of assistance. And it's also important to know that more than 50% of those private rental assistance recipients, those who receive bond loans or ongoing private rental subsidy, reported that they couldn't sustain their rental tenancy after receiving this. So I thought that it's a very important. Okay. And let's focus on bond loans because they were the most commonly offered private rental assistance, as it was reported by our survey respondents. But it's interesting to see that 32% of all respondents across all these three states were offered private rental assistance, bond loans, I mean, but only 20% accepted that. And this is quite different from, across these states. New South Wales, we have this difference, the number of people who were offered bond loans and the number of people who accepted that. There is a greater difference than in ACT and Victoria. And when you ask about the reasons behind that, they mention inability to repay the loan, the stigma attached to loan holders by real estate agents, and because of the low threshold that was set for the maximum rent. And this is a quote from a female respondent, actually, to our survey, who received the bond loan, but she didn't receive it. I applied for bond assistance and was approved, but was not told the repayments of the loan were so high. I feel I should have just stayed in the car, as I can't afford to leave as it was, without having to fork out so much more to repay it. Okay. How about social housing? So we talked about private rental assistance and their effectiveness, but how applicants actually were happy or satisfied with social housing and actually saw this assistance as effective. When we ask this statement, if getting a social housing tenancy provided relief from anxiety around the housing situation, 90% agreed with this statement. And you can see, from the quotes from the interviews, and also from the survey, social housing provided a more stable life. The anxiety levels dropped, and later you can see that they say their life improved, they got their autonomy back, they helped their confidence, and they could even get clean up drugs. So it brings us to the next statement. They wanted social housing tenancy as a stepping stone to something better. So it's not just having a stable life, but also to achieve something more. Social housing remains the preferred form of housing assistance. And as you can see, the majority of both cohort A and cohort B said that social housing was ideal for them. And compare that to what we actually found from the private rental assistance. And this brings us to the last point about accountability for the longer term outcome. It was interesting that most restrictions didn't actively monitor or assess the effectiveness of private rental assistance programs. And this was something that was also raised by the Queensland Audit Office. And they took this no news is good news approach. So if they didn't actually hear back from those who received private rental assistance, they thought that, okay, they are, they're having a happy life in private rental. So that's they didn't actually go back and just ask them, but it couldn't be the only reason that they didn't come back to ask for more help. Would be treatment by housing and support staff. Around a quarter of the research participants, in the survey and in the interviews, they were unhappy with the way that they were treated by housing assistance providers, and they said that their behavior was discourteous, and discourteous. It was upsetting. It was emotionally damaging. So I'm just going to read aloud these two quotes. I found the experience to be very difficult to the point I couldn't cope after the interaction with the department. They have been rude, aggressive, and didn't bother to read my file to understand my mental health situation. Every encounter had left me very ill. And the other one, every agency treats you as a number, a problem for them, and they almost blame you for not being able to find affordable housing on a pension income. If I was homeless again, I doubt I would go through this process again. It is dehumanizing and really affected my mental health. And finally, these are the policy development options that we offered in our report. So the first one that we suggested was to integrate the needs assessment interviews and personalized advice into the application process to better understand applicants' needs. And as part of that, departments could actually create a personal housing plan for each housing assistant applicant. And this is something that's being done in Western Australia here and in the UK. Also, they need to review application process and the system structure to make sure that it's clear and accessible for the target population. And we also suggested establishing a statutory basis for private rental assistance to clarify the types of assistance available, the terms and procedures. So if applicants wanted the agency to take a review of the decision, they could actually follow those terms and procedures. And also, we suggested tracking the short and medium-term outcomes of the private rental assistance recipients. And we also suggested establishing a partnership between the government and private housing providers to make sure that those assistance products are really working in the private rental market. Last but not the least, that the departments need to update their statistical data to better understand how social housing waiting list is being managed and how assistance products are being allocated.
Got a few comments online. How suggested that the issue of what can applicants expect by right has become more topical in the past few months with the introduction into Parliament of a private member's bill proposing that adequate housing should be framed as a human right. And the next comment is the fact that a majority disagreed with the diverted statement was a slightly surprising finding from the research team perspective.
These are the comments made by how there was the research members. Yes.
I've got a question about the personal housing plan. And I get that the examples that you're pointing to there are outside of the jurisdictions where you were surveying people. So you wouldn't have responses from the people you surveyed or spoke to who would have an experience of this planning process. But I've wondered, I feel ambivalent about it, and I wonder if the idea of a personal housing plan could also be yet another discipline or another on applicants, another way of pushing them around, because they already fill out diaries and there's already a lot of conditions imposed on people. And I wonder if I can see how a plan could be a positive thing that may put a bit of obligation on assistance providers, but I wonder about whether it ends up disciplining and pushing more busy work onto applicants. And so I wondered if maybe if there was anything you did here.
No, I think that's inquiry research project A that actually I think looked at it when we started co-designing that process. I think she probably found more on this, how applicants should be part of this process of probably designing a personal housing plan, not just something that's being imposed to them, but something that they actually are being co-designed by having them at the beginning of the process.
Okay, good.
We have a question in the chat. So is a fair summary that the process to get social housing and to get rent assistance are both difficult, that those who get social housing are happier and those who get rent assistance are less happy?
Both difficult. Yeah, I think the level of difficulty is different, but I think from the survey, we can actually say that those who got social housing, that they are happier than those who got rent assistance, because those who receive rent assistance still need to find rental tenancy before they actually get the assistance, and they found it really challenging. But in regards to the first one, if it's really difficult to get rent assistance, it wasn't that much difficult actually for some of those applicants. If they were eligible, they found it quite easy to get those assistance. But whether they were actually effective or not, that's another issue.
We have a question, a hand raised, David Lilly.
He's just asked if you can stop screen sharing.
I don't think that it could actually see me bigger if you. David, do you have any questions?
Yeah. First, I just wanted to say thank you. Very, very timely, as I'm sure you and most of the people online or in the room are aware, with Homes New South Wales looking at reviewing a bunch of policies, and particularly the application process. This is absolutely perfectly timed. My question is really about your policy recommendations. You've talked about personalised advice and personal housing plans. And I know in New South Wales, to some extent, they've sort of gone in the opposite direction. The housing assistance sort of application process is, it's almost an AI thing. People apply and they get channeled into a particular product that Homes New South Wales thinks will best meet their need. So I'm curious about whether you have any sort of New South Wales specific recommendations, particularly as they are going through a bunch of reforms around the particular application process for assistance here.
Not really. So about this personal housing plan, probably help is online, I guess. Might have more a recommendation because we've done some research in the UK context. So I don't think that it's something that we can actually specify for New South Wales based on that context. How do you would you like to add anything here?
I don't think I really can actually. I can't recall. Well, I guess perhaps just wasn't involved enough to pick up aspects of this which are just specific to New South Wales. But I mean, my general impression, David, is the other states are worse. So it's an orderly system, or in my judgment, the way New South Wales deals with these things is relatively orderly and, you know, even more, a bit more accountable than most of the other states. I mean, there are these quarterly stats that they publish. There's, you know, there's a series that's been going now for quite a few years, which it's pretty obscure to find it, but it's there on the New South Wales government website. It's still called facts, you know, analysis or something. You know, yeah, I'm sure it could be improved, but I think some of the other states have got quite a bit to learn from this one.
Yeah, I agree. And having done some research with you and others a couple of years ago, I think we found exactly that the New South Wales system was very efficient, and they had looked at the sort of ethics, if you like, of what they were doing, perhaps more than others. It's just that personalization thing that sort of piqued my interest, because they all do feel a bit depersonalized when they're trying to channel you into what they think you need rather than asking you what you think you need. But yeah, in the current funding environment and the housing crisis, perhaps we have got about the best we can hope for right now.
Thanks, David.
Here we have another question by Bronwyn Kippen. I wonder about the relation between PRA and rental reforms. Government's increasing willingness to invest in PRA, but many still hesitant to limit rent increases amount.
Yeah, I'm not really sure if I can comment on that. Please, would you like to?
Sorry, what was I was thinking about what David Lilly had said. So government's increasing willingness to invest in PRA, but hesitant to limit rent increases. Yeah, so there's, as Fatemeh said, there's different types of rental assistance, and somewhat confusingly, there's what's called private rental assistance offered by state governments, which is quite different from the rental assistance offered by the Commonwealth government, which is the cash payment every fortnight that eligible social security recipients receive. That's Commonwealth rent assistance, and that's they spend even more on that than they do on social housing. And then there's the PRA. PRA at the state level is this range of bits and pieces, isn't it? It's like you're saying, bond loans, and sometimes it's a subsidy for a private rental tenancy, you know, and it's tied to that particular tenancy in a way that CRA isn't. But other times it's these other, I guess, in a way that appears more flexible, but it also looks a lot more bits and pieces. It doesn't have a statutory basis. They're things that housing authorities have made up over time. So the question about it tends to be in relation to CRA, the Commonwealth payment, that there's this question of, is that money that's just going into higher rents? I don't think the bits and pieces that state authorities are doing, I don't think there's the same suggestion of that. There was some research done a few years ago by Huri that I was involved in, Hal was involved in, that and some modelling that suggested mostly CRA doesn't go into higher rents, although in some areas it does, particularly disadvantaged areas. There's some evidence for CRA getting captured in higher rents. That research also showed that CRA has a pretty spotty record on getting people into affordable housing. So the argument for rent regulation, I think, is still there, and it's quite consistent to have both types of assistance, have a regulation on rent increases, but also this cash payment to private renters and to community housing renters, low income, who who are otherwise paying rents that put them in distress. So I think you could have both.
There's a bit of conversation going on with Al and Jeff, and yeah, I think I responded there. Well, we have no more questions.
Well, I was going to say something like this is David Lilly's comment about the efficiency of the New South Wales system provoked me a bit, and that was that yes, New South Wales evidently has a more exacting priority system, a system of prioritising applications, and more so than other states. And in that respect, it might be efficient and that might be a good outcome in terms of the rationing stuff. But I still think we need to. I think we need to come back to what you're highlighting, Fatemeh, about how rough this process is on people and how even if an efficient way of New South Wales has come up with an efficient way of rationing its scarce public housing resources, it sounds like it's a traumatic process for a lot of people. Perhaps I can give you the last word on that from other things that you may have picked up in the research.
Yes. There were more strong actually quotes that I actually put on the slides, and they all showed how people experience the whole process of application and the wait very difficult, and it could actually go for years, and it's just the treatment of the staff from just understanding the whole process and application, and it's not just like those people are those that actually are struggling with other types of difficulties in their life. They have a child with disability, they have some mental health issues, and they couldn't find a rental property that could actually get private rental assistance based on what they found on the market. So they have a lot of issues or difficulties experiencing their own personal life, and this process is not actually making that life easier for them.
Right, Greg, Geoff, raised hand. Go ahead, please, Greg.
Thanks, Fatemeh. Thank you for that. That was an excellent presentation and quite impressive to get all that different data and collate it. So well done. It was. I just wanted to comment that having heard everyone talk about how difficult these are, I think it's because they were designed, as someone sort of commented, as ad hoc responses when people were already in difficulty. So the sort of the way I would think about these is within the then Department of Housing, now Department of Communities and Justice, at least in New South Wales. Yeah, it was sort of like having a bunch of money so that when they found someone who was about to lose their tenancy, they could give them a bond loan or they could give them a one-off rental grants. But as Fatemeh and others have identified, the interesting question is then you end up with all these ridiculous processes and negative outcomes that actually haven't helped the people in the way they were intended. But like many things, it's been interesting because I've seen people say, yeah, well, we're just trying to have stuff because it's crazy that someone would lose their tenancy. And so we want to have money ready to help them not lose it. But interestingly, your research shows it's actually creating more distress probably than, or at least from the sample you got, which I think was about 6.5% response rate. That population at least is saying it's causing more stress than what it was supposed to alleviate. So I thought that was a useful insight. Thank you.
Okay.
There's no more questions.
Okay.
Yeah, I think.
Okay, thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Fatemeh. And I'd like to remind that our next seminar will be held in 2 weeks, and our research associate Chris Hartley will co-present with Anna Mortimer on their project titles Outcome Evaluation in the Housing and Homelessness Systems. Thank you, and I'd like to wish everyone a good afternoon.